Okay, this is chapter 68 of The Night Singer. 68. The corridors were still largely empty, but Hannah and Eric walked on either side of Gabriel, with Hannah keeping a lookout to the right. None of the students they passed seemed to pay them any notice, but an older woman turned and watched them leave. It wasn't the people around them that worried Hannah, it was Gabriel's reaction if anyone here said anything. People became unpredictable when they were under stress. Eric pushed open the main door and Hannah cast one last glance back inside. Sandra Dahl was standing in the corridor watching them leave. Perhaps Eric had been right after all. When they reached the car, Gabriel hesitated in front of the open door. "You don't have a choice," Hannah told him. "You have to come with us." Gabriel studied her for a moment, and his lips moved as though he were about to speak. Right then the school door opened, and he closed his mouth and climbed into the back seat. Eric excused himself, saying he had to make a quick call to his father-in-law in all likelihood. Hannah was curious, but she climbed into the passenger seat and turned to look back at Gabriel. "We're taking you to the station in Calmar for an interview. You're under arrest on suspicion of having killed Joel Forsland, and you have the right to a lawyer during the interview." Hannah spoke slowly so that Gabriel would understand what she was saying, but he simply stared at her like he hadn't grasped a single word. As she began to repeat herself, he interrupted her. "I don't want a lawyer." Eric jumped in behind the wheel. Hannah glanced at him wordlessly, asking if everything was okay. "My mother-in-law had a heart attack. She's in the hospital." He shook his head. "Sapriya isn't answering her phone. She's probably with a patient." "What do you want to do?" "Nothing right now. I left a message on her voicemail." Eric started the engine and pulled away. "How bad is it?" asked Hannah. "Too early to say." Yadu sounded incredibly confused. It was difficult to talk to him. Hannah glanced back at Gabriel. His eyes were on the door, and he didn't seem to be paying any attention to their conversation. His hands were resting calmly in his lap. He wouldn't be able to get out of the car even if he tried. The rear doors couldn't be opened from inside. Hannah wanted to convince Eric to forget about the interview and head straight to the hospital, but she knew that she would never agree to something like that herself. As though by reflex, Hannah turned to look out the windows. Eric drove up onto the Overland Bridge. She felt a sense of calm flooding toward her from the water, but it couldn't quite remove her tension. They were at a critical junction in the case. Her gut told her that Gabriel Anderson was guilty, but that didn't mean he would confess, nor that they would be able to bring about a prosecution. She peered back at him again. He didn't seem to have moved. The turnoff to the police station was drawing ever closer. "Are you sure?" Hannah asked. That was as far as she intended to push it. Eric responded by making the turn. They led Gabriel up to one of the interrogation rooms. "Do you want anything to drink?" Hannah asked him. Gabriel looked up at her like it was the most idiotic question he had ever heard, then shook his head. Eric started the tape recorder, stating the date, time, and who was present, and explaining what Gabriel Anderson was suspected of. "Could you tell us what happened on the night between the 14th and 15th of May?" asked Hannah. Gabriel's eyes darted between her and Eric and the door, but just like in the car, there was no way out. The sigh he let out was little more than a sob. "It was my 40th birthday on the Tuesday, and Ulrika threw a party for me. The neighbors came over and we had a barbecue. The whole thing made me realize what an idiot I'd been." "Had been?" "Yes, I'd been having an affair, but I decided to break it off. I was sick of being an asshole. I love Ulrika, my kids. They're the only ones I want." It was a good sign that Gabriel was answering their questions. The vast majority of interviews went smoothly, more conversation than anything else, when the suspect talked, that is. Sometimes they refused to say a word, and they occasionally told stories that were utterly preposterous in an attempt to dodge the blame. "Did you see the other woman that night?" "Yes, I went over to her house." "So she lives in Guardby too?" Eric filled in. "Yes." "Who is she?" asked Hannah, fully expecting him to say Sandra Dahl. "Rebecca, Joel's mom." Hannah was so shocked she couldn't hide her reaction. She had heard terrible things during interviews in the past, but she had always managed to mask what she thought. If she didn't, there was a risk the suspect might clam up, but this time it hit her hard. Why hadn't Rebecca said anything? Had she known who had killed Joel all along? "Where did you meet that night?" Hannah asked, perfectly aware of how accusatory she sounded. "In her studio." "And how did Rebecca react to you telling her you wanted to end their affair?" Eric asked, drawing the attention to himself. "Not well at all. We argued." "Had you been drinking?" "Yes, we had quite a bit at the barbecue. I also took some wine to the studio and we shared that. I needed it to give me the courage." Gabriel paused and stared down at the table. "What happened in the studio?" Eric asked, his voice calm. It was so hard, said Gabriel. She started screaming all kinds of terrible things. Some of it was true, but most of it wasn't. I was just happy that I'd ended things. Hannah knew she should keep quiet, but she couldn't. How did all of this end in Joel being stabbed? All she wanted to know now was the extent to which Rebecca had been involved. Gabriel's eyes were still fixed on the table, and it was clear that he was on the verge of losing control. Did you stab Joel? Asked Eric. Gabriel shook his head. If you could just repeat that by speaking for the tape. No, I didn't stab him. I told Rebecca I didn't want to listen to her anymore, that I was going, and she threw herself at me. I took a step back and she slumped onto the floor. She was lying there with her arms around my leg, and I told her to pull herself together. Gabriel's cheeks flushed. Hannah assumed that the words he had used were considerably coarser than that. She crawled off to the bathroom, and I could hear her throwing up. When I turned around, I saw someone looking in through the window, so I ran outside. At first I couldn't tell that it was Joel, because he looked so strange. His face was covered in blood. Gabriel gazed longingly at the door. Keep going, Hannah told him, only just managing to keep her voice steady. I think I grabbed him. I wanted to talk to him, to explain what he'd seen, convince him not to say anything, but he pulled away from me and fell onto his stomach. When he got back up, he looked even stranger. He shoved his hands into the pocket on the front of his hoodie, and when he pulled it out again, it was covered in blood. Gabriel trailed off. It was obvious his thoughts were elsewhere, probably with Joel. What did you do then? Asked Hannah. He didn't reply, but as she repeated her question, he began to tremble as though he had a fever. I panicked. I told him I'd take him to the hospital and led him over to the car. That's what I was going to do, but he was bleeding so much his hoodie was soaked, and it started seeping into the seat. He had a knife in his pocket. Can you believe that? A fucking knife. Yes, said Hannah, attempting to prevent Gabriel from clamming up. He died in my car, and I didn't know what to do. I must have driven around for at least an hour. In the end, I left him over in Mockelmosen. Why didn't you call for Rebecca? Hannah asked. Yet again, she managed to keep her emotions out of her voice. She didn't want him to withdraw into himself, leaving her without any answers. But the question made Gabriel fall apart. He slumped forward onto the table, his body shaking as he sobbed. I couldn't face her, he sniffed, and I didn't want her to see, not in the state she was in. Why didn't you just call for an ambulance? Gabriel sat bolt upright. I panicked, he said. I thought it would be quicker if I drove Joel to the hospital myself. Thought I'd be able to talk to him on the way, convince him not to tell Ulrika anything. So what happened? Asked Eric. Joel died, and I wanted to save myself. He was already dead, so it wasn't like I could do anything for him. But my family, I had to save it. Ulrika had given me so many chances, and it would have wrecked my marriage if she found out I'd been with. I love her. Ulrika, I mean. Jesus. I don't know how I could have been so fucking stupid. Hannah didn't know what he was referring to, and Gabriel seemed to notice because he looked straight at her. I should have called an ambulance, he said. I regret it so much that it's killing me, but it was like my brain short-circuited. I couldn't think straight. How did you leave Joel? Hannah asked. At the rest area in Mockelmosen where he was found. Yes, but I mean, what did he look like when you left? He was dead, said Gabriel. He didn't have a pulse. Perhaps he was struggling to understand what she was getting at because he was so upset, or maybe he simply didn't want to talk about it. Describe how you left Joel at the rest area, Hannah persisted, and how he looked when you drove away. I pulled him onto the ground, said Gabriel. The knife fell out, and I put it back in the car. I tossed it out the window later. Did you touch it? Through the arm of my jacket. Where? On the blade itself, next to the handle. And Joel? Describe him. He was lying on his side. He wasn't moving. Did you put anything in his hand? No, said Gabriel, suddenly sounding uncertain. Joel was leaning against the wall when he was found, said Hannah, and he had a bloody cranesbill flower in his hand. No, said Gabriel. That can't be right. It really did look like he didn't believe her, but that was probably just what he had to tell himself in order to cope. What Hannah needed was air, but she had one last question left to ask before she could end the interview. Do you think Rebecca saw anything? No, I'm sure she didn't. Hannah switched off the tape recorder. What happens to me now? Asked Gabriel. We'll need to talk to the prosecutor, and you'll definitely be booked into custody. Gabriel clearly hadn't been expecting to leave. What are you going to tell Ulrika? He asked. About Rebecca, about what happened. We don't have to say anything more than you're being held in custody. Ulrika already knew you were having an affair, but I don't think she knew who it was with. The last few moments. Joel wakes up without any idea where he is. Last thing he knew, he was in a car. It's so dark here, and the air feels cold on his face. That was probably what woke him. His cheek is resting against something rough, gravel maybe. He lifts his fingers to his stomach, but they quickly become sticky with blood. His body hurts all over, not just there, his head, his ribs, his back, but he can still move. There is a wall nearby, and he shuffles over it and leans back against it. Why has Gabriel left him here? Why didn't he take him to the hospital? His eyes begin to make out different shapes in the dark, but Joel still can't work out where he is. He looks up at the sky, at all the stars there, Mom and Gabriel. No, he doesn't want to remember what he saw. Mom throwing herself at Gabriel, the ugly look of longing on her face. Today has been such a shitty day, and it feels like it's never going to end. It just keeps getting worse and worse. Joel leans to one side. He needs to stand up, to get out of here, but he doesn't have the strength. His fingers brush something as he braces himself against the ground, and he is surprised to realize that it's a flower. He lifts it to his eyes to get a better look, but it is too dark to see. He wants to go home, to his bed, and to his family. Tina was right. He needs to tell Mom. Something seemed to click when Tina used those words. Non-binary, they. It was like everything suddenly fell into place. Maybe that was why he had pushed back against it, pushed Tina away. He needs to apologize to her for all the horrible things he said. Micah. Joel tests out the name in his mouth. Once he is old enough, he'll change his name to Micah, unless Mom lets him do it sooner, that is. Maybe it'll be easier to talk to her now that he knows she has a secret too. Joel leans back against the wall and closes his eyes. His heart is beating like a tiny bird hopping around in his chest. He can hear them again now, the high, quick tones that kept him company as he was walking to the woods. The night singer. He smiles. Everything will be okay, if only someone would find him soon.